Good afternoon and welcome back, and thank you all for joining us for one of the last sessions of this year's Ideas Festival. My name is James Merle Thomas, and I'm the Executive Director of the Resnick Center for Herbert Byers Studies, a stunning new building erected on the edge of our campus. And if you have not taken a moment to visit that site, I strongly encourage you to do so. As you can see, it is a gorgeous two-story museum-grade facility that relates to the art and legacy of Herbert Byers, a Bauhaus-trained artist who's very central to the identity of Aspen and to the Institute. And as many of you know, his many creations across the campus have served as the backdrop for our programming for over 70 years. And I'm really grateful to be inaugurating this project that we've been working on over the past year, with a special thanks to not only the Resnick family and the leadership of the Institute, in particular Dan Porterfield, but also our many, many partners across the entire Institute, including the Office of Institutional Advancement, Elliot Gerson and his many programs, Adrian Brodeur, Katie Boone, and in particular our local programs here on our campus, including our leadership and staff in our facilities division, Aspen Community Programs, and of course the Aspen Meadows team, and of course the lovely Aspen Ideas team who have helped to produce this wonderful event. And the reason for that on-ramp from Byers, and as you can see here some of these sculptures, is that the idea of monument, which we'll turn to today, is something that was no strange topic to Byers himself. And already in the 30s, Byers was interested in making photographic collages that looked back on a longer history of monuments, from antiquity to the kind of statues you see erected after the French Revolution. And at the same time, I think we can think in ways that are very productive to today's conversation about the idea of a monument not unlike a natural landscape. And the idea of the givenness of a monument is something that we'll be really excited to talk about today. And as an on-ramp to that, I want to mention, as you see here, some very strange images. Right around the same time that Herbert Byers was collaborating with R.O. Anderson, the second president of the Aspen Institute, R.O. Anderson was also the president and chairman of the Atlantic Richfield Oil Company. And around the same time that Byers was creating Anderson Park, he also worked on a very curious project called the Project for Visual Improvement at the Arco oil refineries in Philadelphia. And I just want to point out how weird these images are. These are big, monumental public arts pieces that were actually never realized, but they were taken very seriously by Byers and by Arco. And what you can see here is that he's taken photographs of a pretty bleak industrial landscape. For those of you who are familiar with Philadelphia, this is just south of the city on your way to the airport. It's not a particularly picturesque landscape. And Byers used these abstract modernist sculptures to create his idea for a kind of visually coherent environment. And I just want to pause and note that these are really, really weird proposals. I think we should recognize that. And they come just right before the bicentennial, right before Philadelphia was about to erupt. And they resonate oddly with conceptual art of the time. It almost looks like a large Claes Oldenburg sculpture or a Saul LeWitt piece. And when I discovered these working in the Byers archives over the past year, I immediately sent images of them and could think of no better colleagues to share them with than my colleagues who are joining me here today on stage, Paul Farber and Naima Salcido of Monument Lab, a nonprofit public art and history studio based in Philadelphia with networks activated across the United States and which cultivates and facilitates critical conversations around the past, present, and future of monuments. So shifting away from Byers, I'd like to talk about some other projects that have been unfolding, first in Philadelphia and then elsewhere. I will just briefly say that from my stage over, we're joined by Naima Salcido, who has been embedded in the Philadelphia arts community for over a decade and now most recently in New Orleans. After completing an MA in Arts Administration from Drexel, she served in a variety of leadership roles at the award-winning and nationally recognized Mural Arts program, and has advised and worked in and around multiple museums and universities before joining Monument Lab. Dr. Paul Farber is a curator, historian, and educator based in Philadelphia. He's the artistic director and co-founder of Monument Lab, also with affiliations at the University of Pennsylvania Weitzman School of Design. And what I want to leap into right here, as we can see, are really amazing public works of art that came about whenever Monument Lab was getting started a number of years ago. This is a project called Citywide, which began in 2017, which intervened into the landscape and fabric of the city of Philadelphia and introduced over a dozen artists, among whom include Tanya Bruguera, Hank Willis Thomas, and Karen Olivier, and really referenced a lot of the existing monuments and public art pieces that were scattered throughout the city while introducing new contemporary art pieces. Paul, I want to begin with you and ask you, could you talk a little bit about how Monument Lab came together, how Citywide came together, and how some of these remarkable pieces, for example, the pieces by Hank Willis Thomas, which were displayed directly adjacent to other public works of art and right next to the courthouse, the City Hall right in Philadelphia, came to be.
Well, thank you so much, Jim, for having us here, and for you and all of your colleagues here at the Aspen Institute. We're so grateful to be here, and with all of you who are joining us near and far. So Monument Lab, we're a public art and history studio, a nonprofit. We work with artists, federal and state agencies, museums. We started as a classroom project. 10 years ago, I was teaching a class at the University of Pennsylvania, and I came to find out that Ken Lum, the artist and professor, was also doing the same thing. And we were teaching about monuments in our classrooms, but we were utilizing the city as part of our text. We were looking at the monuments that existed, but also trying to read and understand the gaps in a city, for example, that is majority African American. At that time, there were 0 full-figure statues to people of color on city land. Just to put that in perspective, there are 3 likenesses of Ben Franklin alone on the north side of City Hall. There are 2 statues to women who actually lived, not counting allegorical figures, in the city of Philadelphia, one of which is Joan of Arc, who is not known as a famous Philadelphian. As we started that work in our classrooms and in conversation with librarians and students and other educators, we realized that there was something to the work that we were doing with our students and the questions we were asking. And so we started expanding our work in 2015 in the courtyard of Philadelphia City Hall. We had experience curating and writing, but really being in the thick of a municipal framework, it was like learning a new language. You have to listen to the shades between yes and no. And a lot of this was about understanding what we had inherited, but also what was happening on the ground from artists, from students, from educators. And in the city of Philadelphia, that meant not just responding to a rich fabric of symbols, but also some of the civic crises that were at hand. 1 in 4 Philadelphians were under the poverty line. We had a murder crisis that continues to this day in gun violence, and rising inequality shifting the city. That project, which included building a prototype monument in the middle of City Hall and opening up a research lab where we could ask a question. We hired our students, a public historian, a social worker, to do participatory research. That was the model of Monument Lab, that we wanted to imagine what comes next. In 2017, in partnering with the Mural Arts program in Philadelphia, 10 municipal agencies, museums, cultural organizations, grassroots activists, we did that citywide. And I think what we found, first of all, was that we asked this question: what is an appropriate monument for the current city of Philadelphia? We like a question at the heart of all of our projects that doesn't have one answer, and we actually don't know the answer to it. We found that people are hungry to share their ideas. They already have relationships to monuments, to civic architecture, to power. They don't always feel like they are asked. And we also were reminded how profound the work of artists like Hank Willis Thomas, Karen Olivier, is in the service of speaking truth to power, to not necessarily accepting the city as is, but trying to understand how we belong better. What are the visions? Artists have a sensibility to pull things out. And again, to remind that this is 2017. This is several years before a broad national reckoning, but to be very clear, we felt like we were late. At that point, we had already seen at least a generation of artists, activists, students, and educators point out that the way that our symbols and systems of power, of democracy, are in need of a refreshed and renewed look. This also, while it was hyper-local in Philadelphia, from that point on, we started building coalitions with folks in other cities. This is how we met Sue Mobley, our current director of research, but the co-founder of Paper Monuments in New Orleans, along with Brian Lee. People in Chicago, like A Long Walk Home's girlfriends. Folks all around the country who may be representing a city as a public art or municipal officer, but more so, we're really a group of residents coming together to try to imagine not just what they've inherited anew, but what comes next.
I want to pick up on that, what comes next. I think one thing that was very striking already with Citywide and coming out of a lot of the work that Naima was doing with mural arts is that it wasn't necessarily about simply taking down some of these monuments that you were describing, right? While that can be part of the conversation, it was as much about introducing other projects that kind of complicated narratives. And that led directly to a project that you both have been very, very involved in, and I will now be the hype man to wave this around. The lessons of that led to a project called the National Monument Audit, which was a major initiative produced in partnership with the Mellon Foundation, which assesses the current monument landscape across the United States. So you spent a year doing this and producing this report. And as you mentioned, it began in some senses with a Philadelphia-based studio, but immediately leapt into kind of a national conversation. Let's talk for a minute about what the audit was and what this thing is. So we have copies that you can take. There are PDFs. We're all about swag. This was a broader project that fit into the Mellon's Landmark Monuments Project, which is, just to be clear, this is a major $250 million investment that was intended to transform the way that histories are told in public spaces. So maybe I'll begin with you, Naima, like how that unfolded, and then what the look and feel of the audit was, and sort of what came from that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say, I joined the team just to back up and transition a little bit. Having been part of a partner organization for the Citywide exhibition in mural arts, I think that the context is helpful in, again, building off of how important those coalitions are, both on a local level and nationally. It takes a lot of folks to really have these conversations across sectors. Even if you're all art-minded or all history-minded, it really takes something to pull folks together. And I think the central research question that really follows Monument Lab and all of our projects is a part of that. It really encourages so much buy-in. And so for the National Monument Audit, there's an aspect of that there too. It is, what does the monument landscape look like in this country? And I'll let Paul jump into that a bit, but there's not one definition of a monument. There's not one department that is quietly collecting all the names of the monuments that live throughout our country. And so it is a Herculean task, frankly, to try and count everything. And so being able to, our research team having scoured, 500,000 records to come up with a data set of 50,000 monuments throughout the country that are reflective of our landscape, it's an incredible project that we're also proud to be part of. But there's so many layers of it, in part, not just because, but also for the many types of partners and folks across sectors that can really leverage a piece like this.
Mm-hmm. And we had a few bullet points about some of the key findings about really what came out of this major national process.
Yeah. So talk about the key findings in a moment, but I also want to just acknowledge the power of coalition and collaboration. The audit was co-directed by myself, Sue Mobley, and Lori Allen, and then had 30 researchers who worked all across the country, multiple time zones. We never had the fortune of being in the same physical room together, but this was a group of folks that brought their skills to bear to help unearth a field of study. And that's the thing, that monuments are central to our zeitgeist. They are central to many of our cities and towns, but they are elusive. It's hard to actually see how they have been built across generations. So what our group did was gather existing data on monuments from federal, state, local, tribal, and publicly assembled sources. We worked with the Harvard Cyber Law Clinic to figure out what we were able to utilize. We had close coordination with the Mellon Foundation, and just immense gratitude to Dr. Elizabeth Alexander and her team who supported us and who legitimately wanted to know what we would find. And as we went through this process and scoured it and tried to figure out what we could and could not do, I do want to just say, and Naima, you said it, but it can't be said enough, that there is a floating idea and a misconception that there is a central agency out there in charge of all of our monuments. They know when they were built and who they were built for, and they can help us bring monuments into this world and evolve, and that's not the case. It is an understatement to say that our record keeping has been woefully under-resourced, that the questions we want to ask of monuments and of public spaces now have not always been part of the priorities of data keepers. So what our team did was scour records that were not meant to collect monuments. They were meant to collect historic properties. That included real estate, cemeteries, depending on how the states kept their records, and we utilized algorithms and checked it, so just immense credit to our research team. And our findings are here. Monuments have always changed. The monument landscape is overwhelmingly white and male. The most common features of American monuments reflect war and conquest. And the story of the United States as told by our current monuments misrepresents our history. And we can talk through each of these points, but I would just ask all of you here and those watching, as you see this, how does this compare with what you already know, what you've already experienced? You may not have needed an audit to tell you these things. Have you been listening with your, to those who've been speaking this out, not just for the last few years, but, Frederick Douglass, W.E.B. Du Bois are among the foregrounded thinkers on monuments decades, if not a century ago. So these are the findings, and I think the one I just want to really hold on is this one, right? And look, as we look through our records of nearly 50,000 conventional monuments, 48,178 to be precise, we have a database that you can search, you can look through our algorithms, it's on our website, monumentlab.com. There are nearly 6,000 monuments that reference the Civil War. 1% of those mention slavery. The Civil War was undoubtedly fought over slavery, full stop. And when we see this, what we understand is that the mention of slavery means that it's somewhere on the title, on the plaque, maybe it's in the metadata that a record keeper kept behind the scenes. This is not necessarily the story of formerly enslaved, self-emancipated Black folks. This is not necessarily telling us about the legacy of enslavement. This is just 1% that have the word. When we think even here, as we gather here in Aspen, something that we found throughout our audit was the story of pioneer monuments. More than half of pioneer monuments were built and installed after 1930, which means that they're after the period of profound dispossession of native lands and conquest, and they coincide with a period of a Hollywoodization of the Wild West. Of nearly 1,000, 916 to be precise, mentions of the pioneer term in our study set, 15% mention Indian, Native American, or indigenous. This does not include pejorative, hurtful terms. And just so if we talk about our monuments, it can be profoundly catalytic to add a monument, to remove one that's toxic. But if we don't grapple with the way that history has lived in public space, how do we understand where we've been, and how do we understand where we're going?
And just to add to that, I think that as Paul noted, some of this may or may not be surprising, but it gives you kind of it gives us all, and many of our colleagues, whether in organizations or cities or towns, really trying to grapple, universities for that matter, trying to grapple with these issues. For me and for others, I think it provided clarity of, we're either going to tell the history of this country or not. it's actually not that complicated, right? You know, if the monument landscape is misrepresenting our history, we have to decide whether or not we're going to tell the truth.
Two things come to mind with that. One to build exactly off of what you were just saying about the project history telling, right? The project of storytelling, and you specifically, Naima, were thinking a lot about the lessons of the audit and how this led to a lot of bigger questions around memory and narrative, and that in a lot of ways was a kind of on-ramp to the subsequent project of regeneration, which is currently unfolding. And the last thing I'll just say is that it was amazing for us to be, alone together, in all of our homes in Philadelphia during the pandemic, which is the year that the audit was produced in 2021. And it was a time when everything that was happening in Philadelphia, it was a city characterized by incandescent conflict, constant helicopters, police kettling, protesters on the highway, a fierce debate about public art and statues, for example, in urban spaces. But I think it's important to note that when we're saying monument, we're not just talking about figures on a pedestal outside of a courthouse. That a monument is a very, very expansive and all-encompassing kind of term that may involve land that has a very, very different kind of connotation. And so I kind of want to tee you up to then think about how did the lessons of the audit then kind of stage for this new project, Regeneration, and then kind of tell us about what's been going on right now in real time.
Right. I mean, as I was noting, it really poses the question for us, like, are we going to tell the truths about the history of this country? And so, with the audit and with that thinking, we see what it looks like when we decide not to do that in our classrooms. We see how that impacts the educational system. And for us, we are, the audit was able to also produce an educator's guide to, offer students of all ages, ways to think critically around this, which we worked extensively with educators on. And while we, for the purpose of the monument, the National Monument Audit, we defined a monument. Organizationally, we see monuments as a statement of power and presence, to your point, which is beyond kind of the classical sense, and really, allows us to think about what stories do we need to see in public, because, like I said, as we're seeing stories being withheld from, what our students learn in classrooms, we do see how that plays out in public space as well. And so for Regeneration, the audit really provides a launch pad for others, but also our own organization to imagine what stories are missing, what are the things that what are the stories we wish we knew, what are the stories we wish we could share about, whether it's our own experiences that are systematically erased from public space.
Yeah, and I just add some context, and you can see here a map of 10 sites around the country that we curated through an open call and then subgranted, thanks to the Mellon Foundation, $100,000 to each team. And we're also really lucky because one of the members of the Regeneration Project from Calle, Puerto Rico, Archivos del Caribe, Natalia, is here. And just to give you a sense of, this was a project that when we did an open call, we received over 200 applications from teams in every US state, most territories, numerous tribal communities, some working across the US-Mexico border. And to just understand, people are really hungry to tell stories. People are hungry to have support to do so in ways that may or may not fit on a pedestal. And I would say, just to go back, because sometimes we get asked, like, is it about statues, is it not? And I just want to reframe it for a moment and say, because I at this festival, heard some really powerful testimony from people who are thinking about, for example, the Supreme Court and the profound impact of the recent decision to repeal Roe on just bodily autonomy, on the ways that the dangers of censorship and banning books, and just putting that into perspective. Why are statues part of the focus? Well, it is much easier to protest a statue than a statute, which is to say that for all of the organizing that goes on in our country, monuments are actually both displays of power and presence for those who have it, who want to reinforce it, but it's also an entry point for those to build their own, to gather around them, or to move the spotlight. And one of the things our audit showed us, despite the number of questions that we often get about toppled monuments, which are an incredibly important facet and framework, 99.2% of monuments were not toppled in the last 2 years, according to our audit. So what we're left behind with? Well, what we wanted to do through regeneration was say, let's actually ask the people doing this work. Let's hear from Michelle Browder and her team in Montgomery, Alabama, blocks away from the state capitol and the new EJI, National Memorial for Peace and Justice, is a monument and a place called the Mothers of Gynecology that historicizes our current challenges to bodily autonomy in a framework that goes back to the time of enslavement and really is trying to foreground Black women's maternal health. If you think about the work in Los Angeles, the team, The Land Under the Plinth, who have been working with the city of LA to get a cultural easement of land that previously had colonial statues to build a Tongva cultural center. Just imagine that idea of Los Angeles as a fundamental place for the Tongva people, the first peoples of what would become Los Angeles, to work with the city and say, we actually want land. Like, this is not just honor or spotlight, this is land. The work of the Rapid City Indian Boarding School Lands Project, this horrific practice, which has been increasingly looked at by the Department of the Interior under Secretary Holland, the forced assimilation, quite painfully and often violently, of indigenous children away from their families and cultures. There's a group in Rapid City, South Dakota, close by to other prominent sites of memory in this country, including Mount Rushmore, building a memorial. This is a moment to understand monuments not as fixed in time, not as permanent or timeless, but as part of a platform to understand where we've been and where we're going.
I want to pick up on something that you were alluding to with this national network, and that part of this is actually not, it's not necessarily immediately a leap to action. It's as much about a very thoughtful process, and it really involves very, very diverse stakeholders, right? And so much of it seems to be kind of site-specific in a way. You know, a conversation you're having with representatives of a tribal land in one area will be having a very different conversation than in an urban landscape. What you're seeing on the screen right now is in real time a kind of shot of some of that process. And I wanted to linger on some of the stakeholders who have really played a central role in the summit that you recently held in Washington, D.C. to kick off regeneration. And I will also note that I think this fits so well with everything about what the Aspen Institute represents, which is basically about dialogue and exchange and sort of effective partnership. So, yeah, talk for us a minute about the experience, the recent experience of kind of emerging from the shutdown we've been in to having this very embedded kind of relationship with the National Park Service and what was going on in Washington with what we're seeing here. Yeah.
Yeah, we hosted our first summit this year and invited representatives of the teams from Regeneration to Washington, D.C. For the second time, actually, to gather, in part because of that, important coalition building to share, this work can feel lonely, even though it's so hyper-local, and being able to build coalitions on the ground is so important. Being able to tap into what's going on in other movements is really important and beneficial. And then to have partners throughout the country, but in particular in DC, like and collaborators like the National Park Service and the Smithsonian, and others really who are able to not just provide resources, but provide insight into how we got where we are, so that folks who are deeply embedded in this work can help vision what lies in the future as well. And so being able to serve as a convener in that way, and also do a lot of resource sharing is essential, I really think, especially for this field like that, includes artists and researchers and historians and community leaders. To be able to kind of connect centrally is really crucial.
And so thinking about these really big, broad stroke projects, right? First citywide, and then this expands into this, major partnership with the Merle and with the Audit, and now the currently unfolding regeneration right now. All of this, of course, is, couched within a conversation we're having ostensibly about beauty. So I wanted to kind of, start to pull those themes together a little bit. How do you see this broader conversation, the processes about the debates, the systems and structures that lead to the establishment of monuments or their removal or their reconfiguration, vis-a-vis a broader conversation about, say, beauty or narrative or representation?
Yeah. A word that we keep talking about is coalition or relationship. And I want to just put out there the idea that we often operate from, or a few of our values. One is that process matters as much as outcome. And another is that beauty, like knowledge, is relational, in that it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It is about how people connect to place, to other species and beings, to those who come before us and those who will come after us. And that's not necessarily everyone's definition of beauty, but that's one we're going to go with here and really foreground this idea that in order for something to be, not to be beautiful, it's more about thinking about that set of relationships that constitute beauty, to understand the historic uses of beauty as a repressive tool, as a commercialized tool, but to kind of take that back and say, beauty is relational. Beauty is something that has to be constituted between people. And again, knowledge is in that same way. It is not enough to say, you have all the answers, we have all the answers. We actually have to do that together. And any time that you hear of a place with a single story, whether it is on a pedestal or not, we're suspect of that. And I think the image that you see up here from our summit was a culmination of a lot of relational things that we found very beautiful and we learned from. One was, as Naima mentioned, the partnerships from the Smithsonian's Restorative History Center to the National Park Service to the Aspen Institute, who are also partners on our summit. But of course, the regeneration teams, also the colleagues that couldn't even be there, thinking about, we saw here in this tent yesterday, Michael Murphy from Mass Design and his whole team sent their well wishes. We had folks who are doing this work. If you're not in the regeneration project, you're still doing this work. There is big and small work to do every day. We want to make sure that as we do that, we're building field and coalition. But I want to just say one last thing about this image that's been up here. I don't know if anyone can guess. Look, we are underground, but we are directly underneath. Do you have a guess?
No, you go.
Okay. We're directly under the Lincoln Memorial. And when you go underneath, we were so thrilled to have the National Park Service's National Mall and Memorials Park Superintendent, Jeff Reinbold and his team invite us there. And when you go under, there's a dirt floor, you are at what was the Potomac River. You're at 0 sea level. You're at a space where by looking up from the Park Service Rangers spotlight, you can see not only where Lincoln's statue is, one of the most visited sites of memory in the United States, but you also see small drips coming down from places where people stand, like the place on the surface where Dr. Martin Luther King spoke in 1963, which has inscription, and whenever you go, there's puddles upstairs, and when we were below, we could see how that site was changing based on how people utilize it. Just thinking on this campus, the marble over at Marble Garden is the same marble that's at the Lincoln Memorial. We can really appreciate history more fully when we unfreeze it, when we understand that there's a process to it, and appreciate not just a process in a neutral way, but understand that that process has been stacked against, that monuments, wherever there's been injustice, monuments have reinforced that. There's such a profound coalition of people who are doing the work, who say, let's bring history to life, let's imagine what's next, and we can value the past, present, and future together.
Yeah, I couldn't help but think about the wonderful conversation yesterday with Kate and Michael on this very stage about, I think there's a leitmotif running throughout a lot of these panels and around this topic that clearly part of that process needs to be about rethinking like top-down notions of taste, like who is defining beauty and who is defining, the narratives that are kind of defining this space. So in that spirit of decentering and kind of finding our people, as it were, I want to take the last minutes and open this conversation up to those who are gathered here, and I see a few hands already. And we do have a microphone coming around, so if you'll wait to grab the microphone, there's someone sitting right here in the aisle with a blue shirt. Yeah. If you can keep your hands up too for a minute, I can find a few others then.
Thank you very much. The statistics are incredibly dramatic, and I'm curious about, of the 5,900 Civil War monuments, are those all owned by local entities for a large extent? And if they are, is part of your objective to do relabeling as a stopgap or removal, or what's the strategy there? That's a very big task.
It's a very big task, and thankfully, we are not alone in that. And I think in many ways we function a bit as a think tank and as a civic agency. So there are times where we are working with a local partner, but a lot of times we are a bridge between the municipal officers who want to figure out how to make change or how to respond to their constituents, to artists and activists and educators who say, I want to be involved, but I'm not sure how I get in there. So just first and foremost, our role is to be a part of the conversation, but we are not doing it alone. Just to your point about ownership or stewardship, it's a profound patchwork, and I'm saying it calmly, but I could really be throwing all the papers that we have here up in the air. It is so profoundly challenging. There are monuments that are owned by a local entity, but the land that they sit upon has been deeded out somewhere else. There is things that are considered monumental but are on private land. I would say every single case is worth diving into, and there are many cases, a multitude of such, that people actually don't know. The paperwork's missing. So there is precedent for this. There's all kinds of civic architecture that, whether deeds are missing or other kind of paperwork, that there are processes for this. And I think in many ways, we want to see monuments and sites of memory as places that we understand are not eternal or timeless, that they were made at a certain moment and they're always changing. And how do we broaden that idea? They're always changing, whether it's by preservation, conservation, weather. It's routine that monuments are added to. So I think just in the spirit of that, now's a great time as an exercise for everyone. If there's a monument that you've walked by or driven by thousands of times, take a moment and pause with it and ask that question of not just who owns it or controls it, but who might it be speaking to?
Was there any success with regard to telling a full story, a relabeling?
There are select examples, but I will use the time we have to point out some of the biggest challenges. One of the first moves that we hear is the idea of let's reinterpret and relabel. And look, we are self-proclaimed word nerds. We know the importance of telling that story and using your words intentionally. But when we've spoken to bodies like Americans for the Arts and other entities, we say, we want you to actually think bigger than that. We want you to think about what are the funds being used to conserve this space, and can they be redeployed toward grassroots sources? What about the idea of adding monuments or more possibilities? And also to keep on the table the idea that harmful, toxic monuments, especially in places like courthouses, should be removed, and let's make up for that in new ways.
I would just add to that of, in the examples that we've seen of relabeling also, there are stories missing from that process. For every relabeling, for every monument toppled, there are activists on the ground who've made that possible. And so losing that is also misrepresenting what's happened. It's not, removing toxic statues is very important, but continuing those conversations, understanding what it takes to maintain an honest storytelling in public is essential, because we're going in loops, things, we've we were seeing, cyclical histories or, increased tensions and lies. And so there's a responsibility we have to talk about those processes as well.
With our remaining time, I'm going to get to a question right here on the aisle and then another one further back.
As a layperson, it's hard for me to be able to find various monuments. I just learned about Poverty Point, and I can't believe it's a World Heritage Site, and I knew nothing about it. I'm curious how many people here know about Poverty Point. Okay. It is as the Aztecs built huge pyramids that occurred in Louisiana as well, and none of us know about it or can see it, so it's still there.
And it raises a good point that part of this conversation, stakeholders are archaeologists, are folks working in universities, but also people who are completely outside of sort of mainstream institutions, who are, in some cases, single-handedly and on their own volition and financial support, literally unearthing these sites. And that's been some of the really amazing projects, coming out of the Smithsonian Histories Project right now. We have a question there in the back.
Hi, thank you. I really appreciated this talk. I was just wondering about kind of the link you see between just sort of the physical difficulty of creating monuments and then the power inherent with what those monuments show. Like, specifically, I was thinking about the relative ease with creating murals in communities and how my assumption, I don't know this, but my assumption would be that murals, like if you were to take an audit of murals nationally, they might collectively provide a more nuanced and accurate representation just because it's frankly much easier for a local nonprofit to create a mural than to create a big bronze statue. And I guess I'm curious, like in my head I was thinking, okay, there's like lots of new 3D printing technology. Like, is the ideal scenario in X number of years that we make it as easy as possible for as many communities to kind of like DIY grassroots create as many new monuments as possible? Or is that like, is there a role for some sort of like federal or state or local entity? Like, what are your guys' thoughts on, I guess, like the ideal end state of what you would like to see for how monuments are managed nationally? And what are your thoughts on kind of like DIY monument building and making it as easy as possible for local groups or even individuals to create their own monuments?
Yeah. Thank you for that really powerful question. And I just want to start it off with the shorthand, both and. And these are not either or binary choices. So can we value our stories of the past and expand and acknowledge that the story has never been full? Yes. Can we imagine new platforms for expression while appreciating those that have been grassroots, those have been made just despite the odds? Yes. And while we do that, might as well make sure we think about resources. I think it's fascinating that to build a monument or public work of art, memorial today, oftentimes we go through the artists. There's a call for artists. And while that can be fully and more democratized, that's a shift to say, we want to know what the artist's interpretation is. This is not easy work. This is heavy work. But by centering artists and resourcing artists, we're able to not only have a thoughtful response to a given place or story, but also the inherent connections and possibilities to deal with presence and absence at the same time. I think we would love to see, whether it's federal agencies like the Department of the Interior or major philanthropic initiatives to invest in people already doing this work. This is not something we'd start over. There are people who are stewarding the stories and public memory in their communities. We are a new nonprofit. We've been doing work for a decade, but we were largely a group of artists who came together. And so while this regeneration, for example, is a model, we'd love to see not only that expand, but to keep learning from the folks also already doing that work. Just one last note about technology is this is about a both and. How do we use technologies, ways to innovate and democratize access, but also appreciate that history lives between people. It doesn't live inside of statues or on pedestals. It lives between people and in places. And how do we resource and value that?
And just to add, I think that, as Paul said, the investment in artists and folks doing this work on the ground is essential. A note on mural making, in part because that's a space I was in for a while, a challenge that frequently that folks who are making community murals are confronted with constantly is gentrification, is those buildings being torn down. I mean, in Philadelphia alone, I think they just had their 4th dedication of a mural celebrating John Coltrane, who's a legend, but because of gentrification, every building it goes up on gets torn down. So, that type of investment in a space that, can be honored for longer than a year at a time, not permanent, but, have an enduring span is important as well.
Unfortunately, we are out of time, but in the spirit of finding our people and thinking about building those coalitions, I encourage everyone to be following Monument Lab on every possible social media outlet and their website, and come see us afterwards if you'd like a copy of the audit. And so thank you all very much for joining us for one of the last sessions of the Ideas Festival.
Thank you.
Paul Farber, Naima, Merle, Salcido. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you, Tim.
Good.